The stories you tell about your pain are keeping you stuck. There's a story you've been telling yourself about why you are the way you are. Maybe it's about the parent who didn't understand you, the relationship that broke you, the opportunity you missed, or the trauma that changed everything. You've refined this story over years, polished it in therapy sessions and late-night conversations, shaped it until it fits perfectly into the architecture of your identity. It explains you, it justifies you, it protects you. But what if I told you that this story, the one you believe is helping you understand your pain, is actually the bars of your prison? We think of narratives as neutral things, mere descriptions of what happened to us. We tell ourselves we're just being honest, just acknowledging our wounds, just explaining why we struggle. But here's the uncomfortable truth that Jung understood and that most of us resist. The stories we tell about our pain become the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And the moment a story becomes your identity, it stops being a description of the past and becomes a prescription for the future. You're not healing from your story, you're performing it. And every time you tell it, you're not processing the pain, you're reifying it, making it more solid, more permanent, more real than it was before. Let me introduce you to someone. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah is 37, intelligent, self-aware. She's been in therapy for 9 years. She can articulate, with impressive psychological vocabulary, exactly why she struggles with intimacy. Her father was emotionally unavailable. Her mother was critical. She learned early that love was conditional, that she had to perform to be worthy of affection. She understands her attachment style, she knows her triggers, she's done the work, and yet, she's still alone. Still repeating the same patterns. Still finding herself attracted to the exact kind of emotionally unavailable men her father prepared her for. When you talk to Sarah about this, she'll tell you her story. And it's a good story, coherent, psychologically sophisticated, emotionally resonant. It has a clear beginning, middle, and ongoing end. It explains everything about her present through the lens of her past. The story works, it makes sense, but here's what's fascinating. Sarah isn't trying to escape her story. She's trying to perfect it. Every new disappointment gets integrated into the narrative. Every failed relationship becomes more evidence for what she already knows to be true about herself. The story isn't a bridge out of suffering. It's the suffering itself, dressed up as insight. This is the paradox at the heart of our therapeutic culture. We've learned to name our wounds, to understand our patterns, to trace our present pain back to its origins. We've gotten very good at telling our stories, but somewhere in this process of naming and claiming our trauma, something went wrong. We confused awareness with transformation. We mistook the map for the territory. We started to believe that understanding why we're stuck is the same as becoming unstuck. It isn't. Think about the stories you tell about yourself, the ones that begin with "I'm the kind of person who," or "I've always been," or "because of what happened to me, I." Notice how comfortable they feel. Notice how they settle around your shoulders like a familiar coat. Notice how, when someone challenges these stories, you don't feel liberated. You feel defensive, threatened, as if they are not questioning your narrative but your very existence. This is because, over time, the story has become you. Or rather, you have become the story. Your identity is so entangled with your narrative of suffering that you can't imagine who you'd be without it. The pain you once wanted to escape has become the foundation of your sense of self. You are the person this happened to. You are the person who struggles with this. You are the person who can't because. And here's the truly insidious part. The story feels like protection. It explains why you don't have to risk, why you can't change, why it's not your fault that you're still where you are. The story becomes a fortress that keeps the world out and keeps you in. We live in an age of narratives. We're encouraged to tell our truth, to own our story, to speak our pain. And these aren't bad things. There's power in naming what happened, in refusing silence and shame. But there's a shadow side to this narrative obsession that we rarely discuss. When does telling your story become performing your story? When does naming your pain become claiming your pain as permanent identity? When does the therapeutic narrative stop being a tool for healing and start being a tool for avoiding the actual work of transformation? The answer is uncomfortable. The moment you start to love your story more than you love the possibility of changing it. Consider the man who, 20 years later, still introduces himself through the lens of his divorce. The woman who can't talk about her career without referencing the mentor who betrayed her. The person whose entire personality is organized around being a survivor. These aren't bad people. They're not weak. They're not doing it wrong. They're doing exactly what we've been taught to do. They're holding onto their story. They're keeping their pain close, examining it, telling it, retelling it. But pain, when held too close for too long, doesn't transform. It calcifies. It becomes the lens through which everything else is seen. It becomes prophecy. Jung once wrote that the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. But what if the opposite is also true? What if when an inner situation is made too conscious, too fixed, too story, shape, it also happens outside as fate? What if the very act of crystallizing our pain into narrative form ensures that we'll keep living it out? Carl Jung understood something that our contemporary therapeutic culture often misses. Consciousness alone doesn't heal. In fact, consciousness without transformation can become its own kind of prison. Jung's project was never just about making the unconscious conscious. It was about integration, about the alchemical process of transformation that happens when we stop merely observing ourselves and start actually changing. What Jung called the shadow is relevant here. The shadow isn't just the dark, repressed parts of ourselves. It's anything we refuse to integrate. And here's what's crucial. Your story about your pain, no matter how psychologically sophisticated, no matter how many times you've told it in therapy, can become shadow material. When the narrative becomes rigid, when it becomes a defense against actually feeling and transforming the pain, when it becomes the thing you hide behind rather than work through, it's functioning as shadow. The irony is profound. We think we're doing shadow work by naming our pain, by telling our story. But often we're just creating a more sophisticated persona, a therapeutic persona, a self-aware persona, an I've done the work persona. This persona can articulate all the reasons why it is the way it is. It has a complete psychological account of itself. But it hasn't actually changed. It's just gotten better at explaining why it hasn't changed. Jung was deeply suspicious of what he called intellectual understanding. He saw many patients who could brilliantly analyze their own psyches, but remained fundamentally stuck. They had translated their suffering into concepts, their pain into theories. They could talk about their complexes with great sophistication. But the talking had become a substitute for the actual work of transformation. This is because, and Jung was clear about this, transformation happens in the body, in the emotions, in the lived experience of the psyche, not primarily in our conceptual understanding of it. You can't think your way out of a complex. You have to feel it, encounter it, struggle with it, integrate it. The story about the complex is not the same as the experience of working with the complex. In Jungian terms, we might say that these stories we tell about our pain represent an inflation of the ego. The ego loves stories because stories create a sense of coherence, continuity, and control. "I am this way because of that" is an ego statement. It creates a logical chain of causation. It makes the chaos of psychological life feel manageable. But this very manageability is what prevents transformation. The self, that center of totality Jung spoke of, doesn't work through linear narratives. The self works through symbols, through dreams, through the irrational eruptions of the unconscious that don't fit our stories. When we hold too tightly to our narratives, we're essentially asking the self to conform to the ego's need for coherence. We're saying, "I will only accept transformation that fits my story." But the self doesn't work that way. Real transformation is usually messy, nonlinear, and narrative-shattering. Consider Jung's concept of enantiodromia, the idea that anything pushed to an extreme transforms into its opposite. This applies to our pain narratives as well. The story that starts as an attempt to understand and heal our pain, when pushed to an extreme, becomes the very mechanism that perpetuates it. The meaning we create from our suffering, which initially helps us survive it, eventually becomes the thing that prevents us from moving beyond it. Jung often spoke about the necessity of holding the tension of opposites, but when we're trapped in our pain narratives, we've collapsed this tension. We've decided who we are based on what happened to us. We've resolved the anxiety of uncertainty by creating a fixed story. But in doing so, we've foreclosed the very possibility of transformation. We've chosen the security of a painful story over the insecurity of genuine change. The individuation process, Jung's term for the journey toward wholeness, requires us to repeatedly die to our fixed ideas about ourselves. It requires us to encounter aspects of ourselves that don't fit our story. It requires us to stay open to the possibility that we're not who we think we are, that our past doesn't determine our future as rigidly as we believe, that the narrative we've built might be both true and incomplete. But this is terrifying, because if your story isn't the whole truth, then who are you? If your pain doesn't define you, then what does? If you're not the person this happened to, then what's left? Jung would say, everything is left. The whole unlived life is left. All the possibilities you foreclosed when you decided your story was complete, those are what's left. The person you might become, if you weren't so committed to remaining the person you believe you are, that's what's left. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of active imagination and dream work. These practices take us out of our conceptual, story-making mind and into direct encounter with the psyche. In a dream, you can't control the narrative. The unconscious presents you with images and experiences that often contradict your waking stories about yourself. A dream might show you being powerful when your story says you're weak. It might show you being cruel when your story says you're always the victim. It might present possibilities your story has foreclosed. The unconscious, in Jung's view, is always compensating for the one-sidedness of consciousness. And our pain narratives are profoundly one-sided. They tell one story about who we are, based on what happened to us. But the unconscious knows we're more than that. It knows we contain multitudes. It knows the story isn't the whole truth. The question Jung would ask is not, is your story true? But is it complete? Is it living? Is it allowing for transformation? Or has it become a dead form that you're carrying around like a corpse, insisting it's still you? The problem of narrative and identity runs deep in philosophical tradition. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote about the danger of becoming your own historian. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. He warned. We might add, whoever tells stories about their suffering should see to it that they don't become imprisoned by those stories. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence is relevant here. He asked, "Would you be willing to live your life exactly as it is, over and over again for eternity?" Most of us would say no, but notice what changes when you're trapped in a pain narrative. You're already living your life over and over. You're repeating the same patterns, having the same kinds of relationships, running into the same obstacles. Your story has become your eternal recurrence. This is what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of the spirit of gravity, the weight that pulls us down, that keeps us bound to the past, that prevents the lightness and joy of becoming. Our pain narratives are spirits of gravity. They anchor us to what was rather than opening us to what could be. Existential philosophy offers another lens. Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence, that we aren't born with a fixed nature but create ourselves through our choices. But what happens when we've used our past to create a fixed essence? When we say, "I am this way because that happened," we're denying our existential freedom. We're claiming that essence, the essence created by our story, determines our existence. Sartre called this bad faith, the lie we tell ourselves to escape the anxiety of freedom. And make no mistake, our pain narratives often function as bad faith. They're a way of saying, "I can't change because." They're a way of avoiding the terrifying responsibility of creating ourselves anew in each moment. Kierkegaard approached this from a different angle, but arrived at similar territory. He wrote about the despair of necessity, the despair of believing everything is determined, that we have no possibility, that we're merely the product of our circumstances. Our pain narratives create exactly this kind of despair. They tell us we're the inevitable result of what happened to us, that we're bound by psychological necessity. But Kierkegaard also wrote about the despair of possibility, the despair of too much openness, too much freedom, no fixed ground. And perhaps this is why we cling to our stories. They protect us from the vertigo of possibility. It's less frightening to be a fixed product of the past than to be radically free in the present. Eastern philosophy offers yet another perspective. Buddhist teachings emphasize anatta, no self, the understanding that the self we take to be so solid and real is actually a fluid, constantly changing process. Our pain narratives are a defense against this truth. They create a fixed self, a stable identity that we can point to and say, "This is me." But Buddhism would suggest Chinese letter SELF is an illusion, and clinging to it, even when it's a self built from trauma and suffering, is the root of continued suffering. The story of who you are isn't you. It's a mental construction, empty of inherent existence, maintained only through constant repetition and belief. The Buddhist concept of metta-loving, kindness, is also relevant. We think we're being kind to ourselves by honoring our stories, by validating our pain. But sometimes the kindest thing we can do is release the story, to stop forcing ourselves to be who we were, to allow ourselves to be surprised by who we're becoming. Consider also the ancient Greek concept of anagnorisis, the moment of recognition in tragedy when the hero suddenly sees the truth. In our context, anagnorisis would be the moment when you recognize that your story, the thing you thought was explaining your suffering, has become the source of it. The moment when you see that you're not remembering your pain, you're recreating it, you're not processing it, you're performing it. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius, understood that it's not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Our stories are these judgments, elaborated and calcified. This happened, and it means I am broken. This happened, and it means I can't trust. This happened, and it means I'm not worthy. These are not facts about reality. They're interpretations, narratives, stories we've imposed on experience. And here's the Stoic insight: we have the power to choose different interpretations, not to deny what happened, not to minimize real pain, but to tell a different story about what it means, to refuse to let the past be the author of our future. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about the narrative identity, the idea that we understand ourselves through the stories we tell. But he also wrote about the necessity of narrative refiguration, the constant process of retelling our stories in new ways. A living narrative is one that remains open to revision, to new chapters, to plot twists that change the meaning of everything that came before. The problem isn't having a story about your pain. The problem is having only one story, told only one way, forever. The problem is when the story becomes liturgy, repeated without variation, without questioning, without evolution. When the story becomes dogma. Heidegger wrote about thrownness, the fact that we're thrown into existence without choosing our circumstances. Yes, we're thrown into our pain, our trauma, our difficult beginnings. But Heidegger also wrote about projection, our ability to throw ourselves forward into possibility. Our pain narratives often acknowledge our thrownness, but forget our projection. They focus on where we've been thrown from, not where we might throw ourselves toward. What all these philosophical traditions point toward is this: the relationship between past and present, between story and identity, between memory and becoming, is more fluid, more negotiable, more open than we typically believe. We're not required to remain the person our story says we are. The meaning we've made from our pain is not the only meaning available. The narrative we've constructed is not the final word. So how does this actually show up in your life? How do you know when your story has become your prison? You might notice that you've been telling the same story about yourself for years. The details don't change. The cast of characters might be different, but you're always playing the same role. You're always the one who gets abandoned or betrayed or overlooked or misunderstood. When new experiences happen, you already know how to fit them into your existing narrative. Nothing surprises you about yourself anymore. You might notice that your story has become your introduction. You meet someone new, and within the first few conversations, you're explaining yourself through your wounds. You're offering your trauma as context, as explanation, as the key to understanding you. You're essentially saying, to know me, you must know what happened to me. You might notice that you feel most yourself when you're in your pain. When you're struggling, when you're suffering, there's a strange sense of coming home. This is familiar territory. This is where you know who you are. When things are going well, you might feel disoriented, like you don't recognize yourself. You might even unconsciously sabotage good things because they don't fit your narrative. You might notice that you're more invested in being right about your story than in being free from it. When someone suggests you might be more than your past, you don't feel hopeful. You feel invalidated. When a therapist suggests you might be participating in your own suffering, you don't get curious. You get defensive. The story has become so central to your identity that questioning it feels like erasure. The first step isn't to abandon your story. That's not possible, and it wouldn't be healthy if it were. Your story contains real truth. Real things happened. Real pain was experienced. The work isn't to deny this, but to loosen your grip on the story as the total explanation of who you are. Start by noticing when you tell your story, not with judgment, just with awareness. When does it come up? What function is it serving? Are you explaining, justifying, seeking sympathy, creating distance? Understanding when and why you reach for your narrative gives you information about what needs its meeting. Then begin to experiment with telling the story differently. not falsely, not by minimizing what happened, but by emphasizing different elements, by focusing on different meanings. What if the story of I was hurt, and now I can't trust, became I was hurt, and I'm learning to trust selectively? What if that person damaged me, became that experience taught me something I needed to learn? Notice, I'm not suggesting you replace a painful story with a positive one. Toxic positivity is just another form of rigidity. The point isn't to tell a better story, but to tell a more flexible one that allows for complexity, for growth, for the possibility that you're still discovering what it all means. You might also experiment with not telling your story at all, with meeting someone new and not explaining yourself through your wounds, with going through a difficult day without reaching for your narrative of why you struggle. See what happens when you don't reinforce the story, when you don't feed it with attention and repetition. Another practice: write your story down, then write an alternative version where the same events happen, but you're a different character. Maybe in this version, you're the hero instead of the victim, or the villain instead of the martyr, or the comic relief instead of the tragic figure. This isn't about which version is true. It's about seeing that multiple interpretations are possible, that you've been choosing one particular framing all along. Pay attention to the moments when your actual experience contradicts your story, when you trust someone even though your story says you can't, when you succeed even though your story says you'll fail, when you feel joy even though your story says you're broken. These moments are gifts. They're the psyche trying to show you that you're more than your narrative. The resistance you'll encounter in this work is profound, because if you're not the person your story says you are, then you have to take responsibility for your life in new ways. You can't blame the past anymore. You can't say, "I can't help it because." You have to meet the present moment without the armor of your narrative, without knowing in advance who you are or what you're capable of. This feels like death. In a sense, it is death, the death of the false self that's been constructed from your story. But on the other side of this death is something Jung would recognize: the possibility of genuine individuation, of becoming who you actually are rather than who your story says you should be. What changes when you loosen the grip of your pain narrative isn't that your past disappears or that your wounds stop mattering. What changes is your relationship to the story. It becomes one part of you rather than the whole of you. It becomes a chapter rather than the entire book. You start to notice that you can hold multiple truths simultaneously. Yes, that hurt happened, and yes, you're more than that hurt. Yes, you were shaped by your past, and yes, you have agency in your present. Yes, your pain is real, and yes, it doesn't have to be your permanent identity. The rigid either slash or collapses into a more spacious, both slash and. There's a particular quality that emerges in people who have done this work. They can talk about their pain without disappearing into it. They can acknowledge their wounds without being defined by them. There's a lightness, not because they've transcended suffering, but because they've stopped making suffering their job, their identity, their constant companion. You might find yourself responding to difficulties in new ways. Instead of immediately reaching for the story that explains why this is happening to you, you stay present with what is. Instead of interpreting every challenge through the lens of your past, you meet it as a new experience. The past informs you, but it doesn't determine you. Relationships change too. When you're less invested in your pain narrative, you stop requiring others to understand you through it. You stop using your story as a test. If they don't get it, they don't get you. You become available for connection that isn't organized around shared wounding, around mutual validation of suffering. You discover you can be known in ways that don't require constant reference to what happened to you. There's also a paradoxical discovery. When you stop holding your story so tightly, you can actually feel your pain more directly. The narrative was a buffer, a way of keeping the raw experience at arm's length. "I feel this way because that happened," is actually a way of not fully feeling. When you drop the explanatory story, you're left with the feeling itself, and often, when you finally allow yourself to fully feel it without the story, it transforms. It moves, it doesn't stay stuck forever. This doesn't mean the transformation is complete or permanent. You'll return to your story. You'll find yourself telling it again, organizing your experience around it again. But now you notice when you're doing it. You have a choice. The story is available to you rather than you being trapped in the story. Jung spoke of the individuated person as someone who's integrated the opposites, who's made peace with paradox. In this context, it means being able to hold both "this shaped me" and "this doesn't define me." Both my pain is real, and I'm not reducible to my pain. Both the past matters, and the present is open. The transformation looks like this. You're at a party, and someone asks you about yourself. In the old way, you would have started, within minutes, to tell your story, to explain yourself through your wounds, to offer your narrative as the key to understanding you. Now you find yourself talking about what you're interested in, what you're curious about, what you're becoming. The pain is part of your history, but it's not your opening line, or you're facing a difficulty, a repetition of an old pattern. In the old way, you would have immediately understood this through your story. "Of course this is happening. This always happens to me because..." Now you pause. You feel the pain, yes. You acknowledge the pattern, yes. But you also ask, what else might be true? What if I responded differently this time? What if I'm not who I think I am? Remember the question we started with. About the story you've been telling yourself, the one that explains why you are the way you are. Perhaps now you can see it differently, not as the truth about you, but as one truth among many, not as the final word, but as one word in a much longer, still, unfolding sentence. Your pain is real. What happened to you matters. The narrative you've constructed served a purpose. It helped you survive, helped you make sense of chaos, helped you feel less alone in your suffering. Honor that. Thank the story for what it's given you. But then consider, what if you're ready now for a story with more possibility in it? What if you're ready to be surprised by yourself? What if the person you're becoming doesn't quite fit the narrative you've been carrying? The work isn't to erase your past or to pretend your wounds don't matter. The work is to stop requiring your future to look like your past. To stop insisting that because you were hurt, you must remain hurt. To stop believing that the story that helped you understand your pain is the same story that will help you transcend it. This is the deepest kind of freedom, the freedom to be more than what happened to you, to mean more than your wounds, to become someone your story never imagined you could be. It's not a freedom from the past, but a freedom in relationship to the past. The past becomes material you can work with rather than a cage you're locked in. So today, try this. Notice your story. Notice when you reach for it, when you tell it, when you hide behind it. And then, just for a moment, set it down, stand there without it. Feel the space that opens up, the possibility, the unknowing. Feel how terrifying it is, yes, but also how alive. You're not your story. You never were. You're the consciousness that's been telling the story. And consciousness is vast and wild and full of possibility. You're the awareness that witnesses the pain, not the pain itself. You're the space in which the narrative unfolds, not the narrative. And in that space, in that awareness, everything is still possible. Every moment is a chance to meet yourself freshly, to discover who you are when you're not performing your story. Every moment is an invitation to the most radical act, to be here, now, undefined by the past, unknown to yourself, open to transformation. The stories you tell about your pain are keeping you stuck, but you have the power, right now, in this moment, to set them down. Not forever, not completely, but just enough to take one step forward into the person you're becoming, the person your pain never imagined, the person your story couldn't contain, the person you've always been waiting to meet.